Howdy, folks. Steampunk Desperado here. Today I'm going to do another review, hopefully a short one, of a very large body of work. It's a bit of an irony and a tough decision because you can't review just one or two of them. You almost feel like you have to review them all, but that's impossible. It is called the Ring of Fire series, and it's kind of an alternate history. It reminds me of a crime show I used to see when I was a little kid. It was called The Naked City, and it was a crime show about New York City, and they had this tagline: "There are 8 million stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them." Well, I kind of feel that way about this series. There are 8 million stories in the Ring of Fire, and this is yet another one. So, yes, it's a very large body of work with a lot of authors working on it, but that's kind of its charm. And therefore, I think this will be of interest to a lot of you. I reviewed the first book in this series briefly long ago in my top 10 alt history video. The first book was by Eric Flint, published in 2000 by Baen Books, and it was called 1632. The premise is that an American town, in this case in West Virginia, it's called Grantville, gets magically transported back in time into Germany in 1630s during the 30 Years' War. All the time of plague and famine and terrible upheaval. And here they are, stranded back in time. Now, as far as how that happens, well, it's aliens. It's these aliens passing by the Earth, and they're kind of playing a prank or an experiment or something. Who could tell with these aliens? And in this case, the time travel involved is of the alternate timeline, split timeline sort, that is, so that we can't have paradox. If you do go back in time, you end up splitting the timeline and you can never come back. You have created a new universe in effect. So this universe has Americans in it, modern Americans in 1600s Europe, and they are stranded there forever, but they will change that world. So it's a pretty interesting idea. Supposedly, Grantville is a fictionalization of a real life town called Mannington. And it's sent back to Germany, and there's a plot of land that exchanges, the circular plot of land. It goes boop back to America. It's basically just empty, burned out buildings because they were having a war. And so that's the last we hear about it in our timeline. These Americans, luckily, they transported with a fair bit of land around the town, including their power plant, so they can continue to have electricity, thank God. Because it's going to be hard enough to survive in a world with hostile powers around there. They don't speak English. They are very superstitious, so they probably view these new arrivals as witches or pawns of the devil or something like that. So the Americans have to think fast and form alliances. And luckily, they have a few people who can speak German and so on. And so they have to talk to the locals and say, no, we're not witches. We are from another time and place, and we can give you wonderful technology if you will ally with us. So that's basically the idea. The Americans have to survive, and then as they're surviving, they're going to try to make 16th or rather 17th century Europe a better place, which would, of course, if this was a time paradox, greatly change their own time. But because this is an alternate universe, it can't. That's what saves it. Anyway, so they end up basically allying with all these neighboring principalities and the powerful King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, to create the United States of Europe. And it's not without its troubles. Another interesting thing about this is that Grantville had a lot of outsiders in at that time, that the Ring of Fire, which was the effect that transported them, the Ring of Fire happened. There was a big wedding going on. There was a lot of people from outside the town there to visit, their college buddy who was getting married. And guess what? You're stranded forever now. You can't go back, to your friends and family. This series has over 70 books, and that's because it's not all by Eric Flint. He opened up his world to other writers, and they started collaborating and doing all these interesting directions. Now, Eric Flint is no longer with us. He died in like 22 or 23, I forget, a little while ago, unfortunately, but I believe his legacy is continued on. So, of these many, many books, about half of them are published by Ban, as the original was, but then they started their own outfit called Ring of Fire Books. Anyway, there's like over 70, most of them novels, but there's several short story collections, all set in this world. Now, I've read about 5 of these, and the ones in the beginning, 1632 by Eric Flint, 1633, Eric Flint and David Weber. After 1633, they branch out into all these different stories and scenarios. And they all say Eric Flint but I don't know how much he actually did with these stories. He may have been more of an advisor than anything. I really don't know because they all have a very different style, the style of the second author. So, of the ones I've read, 1634, The Galileo Fair, Eric Flint and Andrew Dennis. 1634, The Bavarian Crisis, Eric Flint and Virginia D. Marco. 1634, The Baltic War, Eric Flint and David Weber again. So they have all of these, and they go on from 1634. There's several. They go to 1635, 1636, etc. But all together, they are called the Ring of Fire. Now, it's an interesting story, and one of the most fascinating aspects is that Eric Flint was a communist. Yes, he was. He was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, which was a splinter communist group. They split off because they realized that Joseph Stalin was a horrible person. Way back in the 40s, they did that. But nonetheless, it's funny because it's got a real rah rah America spirit. And I think they had more conservative authors in some of the mix, like David Weber, for example. He does a lot of military sci-fi, and I'm a big fan of his. And anyway, so it's got what I call sensible liberal sentiments. I'm talking about like Kennedy liberalism from the 1960s. Yeah, my grandparents were Democrats. It was a time when the Democratic Party had not lost its mind. And I'm not just slamming them. I think the Republicans, most of them have lost their minds as well. But be that as it may, yes, Flint was a leftist, but a lot of the books have more of a moderate tone. These plucky West Virginians, they have this can-do spirit, and they're going to survive no matter what. And, they encounter a lot of hardships. Many of them die. But they bring in a lot of outsiders, too, into their community, and they are kind of forming a new society. I don't remember a lot of the names of the characters because uh, I usually consult Wikipedia to refresh my memory, but they don't list very many of them except for Mike Stearns, who was the president of Grantville and later the United States of Europe. He was a union leader of the United Mine Workers. And of course, because the original writer was a leftist, right? Although I'm cool with unions, they do some good work, or at least they used to in the old days when they actually had teeth. Anyway, he is the primary good guy, and he has a lot of challenges ahead of him. Now, one of the bad guys was the mine owner. So he's an American and he's in with the rest of them, but he's kind of arrogant. And it's funny, all these other characters, they have to step up and become prominent. A lot of them are high school teachers who have to bring this knowledge back to the past. And there's an English teacher, I believe she was an English teacher, who's like a major leader. She does a lot of the, communications. And the locals say, "What? A woman? I can't believe it." And there's a science teacher who does a lot of the chemistry for their weapons and so on. I believe there's a radio hobbyist who ends up creating the radio station because they use that when they do their foreign missions. They're the only ones with radio. Kind of an advantage. And luckily, some of the men have military experience because they have to form an army. And, that's another interesting thing, too. So they call themselves uptimers and they call all the locals downtimers. And a lot of them end up marrying downtimers and getting in relationships and so on. And the town becomes variously mixed with local Germans. But again, it's got a very American flavor because the Americans have this dominant technology. Now, I think I may have already mentioned that they allied with a lot of local kingdoms and so on, including Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus, kind of a stand-up guy. Of course, he's not really interested in democracy, but he's actually doing some good, and I think he comes across as an honorable man. In any case, one of the villains is Cardinal Richelieu of France, who is plotting. He's like the evil plotter. He's trying to bring the Americans down, and a lot of other great historical characters such as Galileo and so forth. And it's funny because already it makes me nostalgic because this was started in the 2000s, and because the people in America were transported uh, before the 21st century, they didn't experience all the horrors of the 21st century that we've lived through. They didn't see 9/11. And all the police state that they tried to erect after that. They didn't see wokeness coming along and dividing people by race and so on, and getting people in screaming matches and all the LGBT excesses. Now, I'm sure there's gay characters in there. I don't recall any, but I would imagine there are probably some in the later books. And so it's not so heavy-handed as a lot of things written, recently with all their political message. No, it's kind of we're all Americans and we're all in it together, and it kind of makes me a little misty. It's very cool. And if you're like that, if you're like me, you will enjoy it. They're not all of the same quality and they're not all of the same tone. I like the David Weber books the best. I think they're the most actiony, but there'll be something for pretty much every taste. I mean, like, for example, the Bavarian Crisis, which involved Virginia de Mars, that was kind of more cerebral. There was a lot of plotting and, uh, jockeying for power kind of behind the scenes and less action, but it was still good, for example. So, over 70 books, a lot to check out. And I think anybody who loves alt history and a lot of steampunks as well would really enjoy this series. I'm not going to rate it because there's just too many of them, too many, and they're all different. Each has their own strengths and weaknesses. So this has been my brief review, sort of the Ring of Fire series, which was begun by Eric Flint back in 2000, and it now has over 70 books that have been written and published. Please let me know what you think about that in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and also check out my works on Amazon. I have the links in the description as always. For now, this is Steampunk Desperado saying adios amigos from the Steampunk Desperado channel, where the past meets the future and the present is extraordinary.